100,046, 100,047.
Oh, hey, let me tell you a little something about McCarthyism. It's a period where people were accused of being communists with no evidence, which led to fear of communism rising.
Hey, imperial presidency was a term used to describe the U.S. presidency because it was uncontrollable and exceeded constitutional limits. This led to acts such as the War Powers Act, which restricted the amount of power a president had.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. I'm part of the counterculture, when people differ from social normalities and of day and age. Mostly hippies and rock and roll music.
Modern republicanism preserved individual freedom and the economy while ensuring that the government would provide assistance to workers in need.
Hello there. The letter from a Birmingham jail was a letter written by MLK that argued for peaceful protest, and it was the fight for what was best for the American dream. This then led to the March on Washington.
Feminine Mystique was a book that told women to educate themselves and get jobs. This book changed the feminist movement and would eventually lead to women getting more rights. Credibility gap was when people began to distrust the presidents because of constant lies about the nation and about the Vietnam War. This led to more and more criticisms over the U.S. presidents.
System. Changes in popular culture caused changes in social attitudes, such as the United States becoming more liberal and more reformative.
A change in popular culture was the counterculture movement.
The counterculture movement was when young Americans would go against the norm in society.
This movement led to the U.S. going through change and becoming more liberal.
The reaction to these affected political debates because it led to court cases such as Brown versus Board of Education and culture changes such as the books Silent Spring and the Feminism Mystique.
These changes also inspired debates about civil rights and giving more and more rights to minorities.
With the change to liberalism and the rise of counterculturalism, the U.S. became more and more focused with going against the norm and giving minorities more rights.
Oh, hey, didn't see you there. The Iron Curtain was a wall imaginary wall that separated Western and Eastern Europe. This name was given by Winston Churchill for the Soviet Union buffer zone. This eventually led up to the Berlin Wall.
Oh, hey, let me tell you something about the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is when the U.S. gave nearly $12 million to help rebuild Western Europe, and this led to Western Europe staying democratic.
Hey, the Berlin aircraft is when the Soviet Union shut down access into Berlin. This led to the United States launching a series of air raids in order to help the people who supported democracy in Berlin.
Honey, let me tell you guys something about NATO. This was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was the first military alliance made to defend all members from outside attacks.
Hey. The Korean War was when North Korea invaded South Korea, which led to the United States stepping in to push back North Korea to the 38th peril. The problem was that once the United States pushed back North Korea to the 38th peril, they invaded North Korea, which led to the Soviet Union and China providing military funds for North Korea. Through all this, there was lots of conflict, and it was eventually solved with the armistice in 1953.
Oh, hey, the Berlin Wall was a wall made by Soviet Union to keep Eastern Europeans in communist countries.
This wall would eventually be torn down in 1980.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is when U.S. spy planes flew over Cuba and found Soviet missiles. This was dangerous because it meant that a Soviet missile could be launched from Cuba and hit nearly any point on the U.S. The Vietnam War is when the Viet Cong attempted to take over Vietnam. The U.S. stepped in, and the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was seen as the start of the bad war. Television began to televise the war, and this made people doubt the war because they were seeing events like the My Lai Massacre and the Tet Offensive take place. Détente was President Nixon's foreign policy, which brought deliberate reductions to Cold War tensions. This policy would lead to negotiations with China and attempts to open up the Soviet Union to negotiations.
Hey! The Camp David Accords was a treaty between Israel, Egypt, and the U.S., and this was basically a treaty of a framework of peace between the three countries.
The Iran hostage crisis was when 52 Americans were taken hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Iran. This was because the U.S. helped an unpopular Iranian Shah through cancer treatment. This led to worsened relationships between the U.S. and Iran.
Communism, communism, communism! Come on, come on.
Containment was the policy that supported all democratic countries who resisted communism. Containment was in the involvement of Korea and Vietnam.
Let me hit you with some facts about the Nixon Doctrine. This promised Asian countries U.S. support, but not through U.S. armed forces.
America in the world. Americans endorsed a new engagement in international affairs during the Cold War because they were afraid. Throughout the Cold War, the tensions rising between the Soviet Union and the United States led to fears of nuclear warfare. This fear led to Americans believing in the policy of containment and were okay with U.S. soldiers going into areas such as Korea and Vietnam to fight off communism. This belief changed over time due to the events such as the My Lai massacre, Tet Offense, and Pentagon Papers. Both Tet Offense and the My Lai massacre were huge failures that were seen on TV and exposed the actual events going on in Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers exposed what went wrong in Vietnam, which further fueled the flame to get American soldiers back home. The change in beliefs led to protests from citizens against the Vietnam War and sending American soldiers overseas, which would lead to Vietnamization, a plan to remove U.S. soldiers gradually and let the Vietnamese fight each other, and the Nixon Doctrine, which promised to support Asian allies, but not through American and armed forces.
The Southern strategy was the Republican Party strategy to increase political support among white voters in the South through racism against blacks. This would then lead to the election of President Nixon. Hello. Let me tell you about the environmental movement. The environmental movement was one of the best domestic policies that Nixon created, and it protected the world from air pollution and water pollution. And this led to more environmental safety in the United States.
Silent Spring was a book by Rachel Carson that exposed the use of pesticides. This led to the clean air and water laws and eventually the environmental movement. Geography. Geography was public concern about the state of the natural environment grew during this period because of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Silent Spring exposed the use of pesticides in food and showed how Earth was being poisoned. The book started an environmental movement which led to the development of the EPA. The EPA, Agency of Environmental Protection Agency, was designed to protect the environment through projects such as Earth Day.
But it don't matter, no, cause I got you. Oh hey, let me tell you a little something about suburbanization. It's when a whole bunch of houses were built together like this in the same neighborhood, compiled together. They all look very similar, and it was an adaptation to the baby boom.
The Immigration Act of 1965 was an act that was based on reuniting immigrant families and bringing skilled immigrants into the U.S. This abolished the previous Quota Act and brought new Americans to the United States.
Hey, cultural pluralism is a mix of cultures which occurred due to immigration into the U.S., which then led to comparisons of the U.S. to a salad bowl because of all the mixtures of the cultures.
The growth of migration to and within the U.S. greatly influenced demographic change and social attitudes in the nation. The Immigration Act of 1965 ended the Ethnic Quota Acts, which favored the migration of Europeans. This affected social attitudes because more and more minorities were getting rights, which made white people angry. The rise of immigration did, however, lead to cultural pluralism increasing in the U.S., which meant there was a mix of lots of cultures. During this period, the U.S. began to become the melting pot it is today. Migration also grew due to suburbanization, which was when people began to move into the suburbs being built and into the Sunbelt.
Civil rights activists such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Cesar Chavez fought for better rights for minorities through protests and civil disobedience,
This then led to the Civil Rights Act and better treatment towards minorities.
The New Left was a group of radical liberals, mostly students, who called for civil rights, democracy, and university reforms while also protesting the Vietnam War. They were part of the counterculture movement that was growing in the United States.
I'm nobody's sugar daddy now and I'm not.
Did you know what the silent majority was? The silent majority was a great body of Americans that supported Nixon and believed in his foreign policies, and they had a great plan to end the Vietnam War. Also, they were against the counterculture, and this eventually led to him getting elected.
Oh hey, the Warren Court was a Supreme Court led by Earl Warren, who was devoted to expanding and protecting rights for citizens. This then led to more rights for minorities.
Identity. The African American Civil Rights Movement affected the development of other movements because African Americans started to receive rights. This made other movements such as the feminist movement, American Indian movement, gay liberation movement, and Cesar Chavez's movement want equal rights as well. The African American movement started the idea of giving minorities rights in the U.S. American involvement in the Cold War affected debates over American national identity because people began to become afraid of communism, which led to ideas such as McCarthyism. Involvement also led people to question whether or not the U.S. should be in wars such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War.
The Fair Deal was a Truman program which called for national health care, federal aid to education, civil rights legislation, funds for public housing, and a new farm program.
Oh hey there, the NSC 68 was a document that advised the president to quadruple its defense budget to form alliances and start massive arms buildup in response to the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb.
The Great Society was Lyndon B. Johnson's domestic policy. It provided a Department of Transportation, which built roads and bridges, a Department of Housing and Urban Development, which built houses, Medicare, which was health insurance, government-funded health insurance for people 65 and up, and Medicaid, which was government-provided health insurance for the poor and disabled.
But why?
Oh, hey. Watergate was a scandal in which Nixon hired spies known as Creep who broke into a presidential nominee's office in order to try to get President Nixon reelected. Throughout the scandal, Nixon claimed he was innocent, but after investigation, it became obvious that he was guilty. This scandal led to the eventual resignation of Nixon and the widening of the credibility gap.
Lyndon B. Johnson was the 36th president, and he launched the War on Poverty, which led to the Office of Economic Opportunity, and he also launched the Great Society, which provided assistance to many Americans in need.
Brown versus the Board of Education was a case that took place in 1954 and it reversed the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson and desegregated all public schools.
Oh, look who decided to show up.
Hey, did you know the U.S. versus Nixon Supreme Court case ordered Nixon to deliver the tapes?
Oh, well, did you know that this was a crucial factor that led to his resignation?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Roe v. Wade was a U.S. Supreme Court that issued laws criminalizing abortion as unconstitutional. This led to the legalization of abortion.
Oh, hey, did you know that the Civil Rights Act ended segregation and banned employment discrimination, and which then led to better rights for minorities?
The Voting Rights Act banned practices in the South such as literacy tests, which were made to stop blacks from voting.
Hey, let me hit you with some knowledge. The Equal Rights Amendment. Let me tell you about it. This was designed to guarantee equal rights for all American citizens, especially aimed to stop discrimination against women. This eventually led up to better rights for women.
The federalism was when Congress approved giving local governments $30 billion to address problems. This eventually gave them more power to local politics.
Politics and power. The changing fortunes of liberalism and conservatism in these years affected broader aspects of social and political power in many ways. The transition from liberalism and conservatism
changed the presidents being elected. At the beginning of the period, very liberal presidents were being elected due to the rise of movements such as the Civil Rights Movement and the Feminist Movement. This led to the laws being passed such as Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Throughout the 1900s, very liberal presidents were being elected due to liberalism. However, when the change to conservatism took place, presidents such as Nixon were being elected. This change led to conservatism taking over for years to come.
Hey, the impact of television is that for the first time presidential debates were being televised, which meant that more and more people were liking Kennedy for his looks and for the way he spoke. This would eventually lead to him being elected president over Richard Nixon.
There's a pee.
Hey, Federal Highway Act was an act that built highways in order to quickly get people out of cities in the event of a Soviet atomic bomb. This Highway Act led to the highways that we see today, such as the 91 and the 15. Affluent Society was a book that outlined how the U.S. was wealthy in the private sector but poor in the public sector. This book led to improvements in the public areas. The rise of American manufacturing and global economic dominance in the years after World War II affected standards of living and opportunities for different social groups in many ways. The rise of American manufacturing led to more immigration into the U.S., which led to programs such as the Great Society that created jobs by authorizing the buildings of roads and houses. The American economy also led to such things as suburbanization and the rise of television. These programs would affect standards of living because suburbanization made life more similar to how it is today, with many people living together in neighborhoods such as the suburbs. A social group that was affected by the U.S. economy was workers. Workers were protected more and more by programs and ideas such as modern republicanism.